Hello guys, welcome to another Laravel lesson. Today we are going to learn about the observer design pattern. Note that the observer pattern is not something specific to Laravel. It is actually one of the common design patterns out there in the software world, software development. So what we are going to do is to first understand what the observer pattern is, how it works. We can also talk about some of the advantages of it. And after that, we dive into the code to see how different ways we can implement this in a Laravel application. So, what is the observer pattern and how does it work? The observer pattern is basically a way to observe the state or monitor the state of your application and take action when that state changes. In simpler terms, what I have on the screen is a really simplified diagram showing the implementation or how the observer pattern works. There are two main parts when we talk about the implementation. The first is the entity being observed. Let's take, for instance, you are building an invoice management application. The entity can be invoice, right? So we can observe the state of an invoice. For example, when invoice is created, when invoice is updated, deleted, that kind of action. The entity being observed is known as the subject or observable, sometimes also called publisher. Then we have the other parts of your code which are actually listeners or monitors that are kind of monitoring the state of the entity being observed, the state of the observable, and whenever that state changes, whenever certain action they are interested in is performed, they will get notified and respond accordingly. By respond, I mean they will do whatever they want to do based on the notification they get. So for example, if this were to be the invoice, the observable is the invoice, this observable X can be the part of your code that sends notification to the customer saying, hey, a new invoice has been issued to you, right? This part of the code, this observer Y, can be the one that notifies admin saying someone in your business generated an invoice. And we might have another one, observer Z, that logs this action in the activity log. So how does it work? The way it works is action is performed on the observable and an event is fired, right? This event can be whatever event that is defined. For example, new invoice is created. These observers are interested in this event. That's why they're subscribed to that event. They're listening to it. So whenever invoice is created, the invoice created event is fired and all the observers are notified that a new invoice is created, and then they take their corresponding action. This is like a high-level summary of how the observer pattern works. Now let's talk about some of the benefits. The obvious one is that you can see that these parts of your codes are loosely coupled. So one of the advantages of the observer pattern is that it supports loose coupling between the different parts of your code. Another advantage of the observer pattern is that it helps you handle the case where multiple objects depend on a single object, on the state of an object. As you can see on the screen, the observer X, observer Y, observer Z all depend, or all of them are monitoring the state of the observable. Now there are other benefits as well as disadvantages of using the observer pattern. I will leave that one for you to dig deeper and find out. For now, Let's move over to the code and see how we can implement or how this is implemented in Laravel. Before we dive into the code, however, I want to first of all point out who this lesson is for. This lesson is for anyone who has at least the basic knowledge of Laravel, right? So we are not going to go into what is Laravel, what is model, what is controller, that kind of thing. With that in mind, what I have is a brand new Laravel 8 project, right? No code written so far. The first thing I want to do is to talk about how we are going to do this. What we are going to do is just make observers to monitor the state of an invoice. When invoice is created, when invoice is updated, that kind of action. So it means that we are going to have a model, invoice model, to work with. First, let me connect to the database I already created, which I called Laravel Observer. That is the name of my database. So you do your own database connection. After that, we head over to the terminal to make the invoice model. Artisan make invoice model, and we add the M flag so that the migration file is also created for the model. Now I will head over to the migrations file for the invoices table. I will define some columns. Actually, since our focus is on the observer pattern, we are not trying to create some real invoice application. I will just keep this simple, right? So let the invoice have description. This is not some real invoice app, right? Let me add one more thing here. Say subtotal. And I would like the description to be optional, to be nullable. All right, then I'll head over to the model app models and declare those two fields, those two columns, mass assignable. So I'll say protected field label, that should be sub total and description. Okay, and then let me make a controller for the invoice. Invoice controller. At the same time, I would like to make a request class where I will handle the validation. So artisan make request. For creating invoice, I will call that store invoice request. And I will make one more for updating invoice. So let me call that update invoice request. In the controller for the invoice, please note that we haven't really got to the gist of the matter, which is the observer pattern. This is just some setup that I'm running through at the moment. So I'll quickly say public function store, and the request we are expecting here is store invoice request. I'll prefer to call this request. In a similar way for update, public function update invoice request. For now, I will just keep this very simple. What I will do here is to return invoice create request, get the validated fields, the validated inputs, right? And for update, I'll leave that as it is. Now let's just go to the validation file. Come on, what's going on here? Here I'll return true. No authentication or authorization stuff going on there. And for the rules, the subtotal should be required numeric and minimum of 0. The description, however, is nullable as we define in the table schema. So nullable string, I will leave that like that for now. I will copy this over to the request class for updating an invoice. Just paste this in here. But in addition, okay, actually I wanted to put the ID of the invoice where we want to update, but I can use route model binding here too. So instead of having that in that validation, so the next thing I will have to do is to go to the route file and define some endpoints. So this is going to be post to invoices, and what we want to do is to create an invoice. So invoice controller class, the method is store as we defined in the controller. In a similar way, for update, you can use patch or put here, but I will leave it at post. And what we are expecting based on our route model binding is this invoice, right? The invoice here. So I will also keep the invoice the update is really simple. What I will do is invoice update request validated. So this will be our, for update, I will just return the invoice. So note that if you do return here, you get an integer because this method returns an integer. Okay, now let's quickly test this, what we have so far, before we go into the gist of the matter. We go over to Postman. I already have those two endpoints defined to save us some time. I mean, in the Postman with this JSON payload. If I go ahead and send, what's going on here? Okay, we need to start the server, PHP artisan serve. So we have the server up and running at localhost 8000. I will go ahead to send this again. Validate nullable does not. So we have an error in the validation nullable. This is nullable. There was a typo there. I will try this one more time. Says okay, we have not run the migration, so make a new tab here, artisan migrate. This creates the migration. I'll send one more time. Now we have created an invoice. Good. Let's go ahead to update an invoice. The ID is 1. I'll go over here. Based on our definition for the route for updating, we pass the ID of the invoice in the URL, which corresponds to this parameter we passed here. I'll hit the update unauthorized. Unauthorized, let me check the update invoice. So I'll return through here. go ahead and send this one more time. Okay, the same typo I had earlier. Send one more time, and we have the update working. So now we have to create an update working. Good. That is the basic setup we need before we get into the gist of the matter, that is the observer pattern implementation. Then we move on to the gist of the matter, which is implementing the observer pattern. Remember that what we are trying to achieve is to fire an event when the state of the entity being observed changes, whether it is create, update, or destroy, that kind of event. And the observers get notified of this state change through the event. In Laravel, or in our example, we are going to do two different things. First, using the observer, event, and the listener pattern, and then we talk about model observers. The first thing I want to do is to generate an event class. That is the event that will be fired, right? So to do that, we use artisan command, php artisan make event. We call this, let's say, invoice created. You can also have for invoice updated, deleted, that kind of thing. Invoice created. So this is the event. We also make a listener or an observer. So let me make one. PHP artisan make listener. Let's call this notify customer of new invoice, right? So whenever invoice is created, we notify the customer, hey, an invoice has been issued to you. And you specify the model, that is the event we defined above. So this is invoice created. This is not the entity being observed, but the event that this observer is subscribing to. So I'll go ahead. What did I miss? Actually, what you specify is the event, not model. The event that this observer is subscribing to. So this should be event. All right, so now we have an observable and one listener. Actually, an event and one listener. Let's go to start with the event class. The first thing I want to do is to register this to the event and the listener, and you do that in the event service provider class. So here, basically, in the listing array, you define the relationship between the event and the listeners. In our case, we say invoice created whenever this event is fired. Then the listeners in this array should be notified. Currently, we have only one, that is notify customer of new invoice, right? Let's go to the event class. In the event class, this is where we can define the entity being observed. In this case, our invoice, public invoice. We do the same thing in the constructor. So whenever we dispatch this event, we are going to pass this as the parameter which should be made available in the constructor. This invoice to be invoice. So when we fire this event, we pass the invoice as a parameter, and this invoice will be dispatched along with the event to the subscribers. Now let's move over to one of the subscribers, that is the notify customer of new invoice. You will notice that based on our artisan command, when we define this subscriber, it actually passes the the event being subscribed to in the handle method. Here, the way you access the object is through let's call this invoice, of course. Say event invoice. This is how you access the model that you are observing, right? So here you can do whatever thing you want to do, maybe invoice service, do something, I don't know, do something, whatever you want to do at this point onwards. But for simplicity, for the purpose of demonstration, I will just log this invoice. Say invoice to array. Let me get the name of this class so we know where this is coming from when we add other observers. Okay, so why not give this a try before we move further? I will head over to Postman once again. I'll hit this. Nothing happened. The reason nothing happened is that we did not actually fire the event. So we need to go to controller. In the controller, what I want to do is invoice to be this, and then here I want to return invoice. But before returning, I want to fire that event. We call dispatch. Dispatch is the static method you call on the event class to dispatch that event. And remember that in the constructor, we are expecting an invoice, right? The way this works is that the parameter we pass to the dispatch method is made available to the constructor, this constructor. That is how we get it over there. I'll go back to Postman, hit one more time, and this time we get what we dumped in the event class. You can see this is coming from notify customer of new invoice, the handle method, as we have it down here. Actually, not here in the subscriber class here. So far we have just one listener or one observer, but remember that we can have multiple observers, so why not we just make one more? Let's call that notify admin of new invoice, right? So we head over to the terminal. I will change this. I will make another subscriber, notify admin of new invoice, and both model option, oh, the same thing again, is not model, it is event. So both subscribers will subscribe to the same event, invoice created. Now what I want to do is actually to do something similar. I'll copy the whole thing here, go over to the notify admin, but this time I will just change what I am dumping here so we know where these are coming from, right? I will just go ahead, go to Postman. Let's call this one more time. I will scroll up a bit. Okay, the reason we are not getting the second one, that is for the admin, is because we did not include that in the array. Remember that you specify all the observers in this array, so notify admin of new invoice has to come here. We go back one more time, we call this, you can see now we get notify customer, notify admin, according to having multiple observers for one event. So this is a quick rundown description of the event and listener implementation that Laravel has. The next thing we want to do is to look at the model observer. let's talk about the model observers. So far, we have a case whereby, or consideration where multiple observers are listening to one event. Laravel gives us a handy way to manage a case whereby an observable is emitting different events. Remember that this observable can emit different kind of events. For example, invoice created, as we have seen. We can also have invoice updated, invoice deleted, invoice restored, invoice is updating, that kind of stuff. What if we have one observer that is interested in multiple events fired by or for the model state, right? So assuming the admin observer, this observer that notifies the admin, is interested in invoice create, invoice update, invoice delete. That is where model observers come in handy. We are going to have one observer class that can listen to multiple events from the observable. So to do that in Laravel, what you have to do is to use artisan command, php artisan make observer. Here we give the observer a name, invoice observer, and we specify the model to observe the state. So the model has to be invoice, of course, based on our example. If you go to the code, you will see a folder, a new folder created called observer. Where is it? So this is the class we just generated. Just take a note, take a look that we are observing different states of the same model based on the explanation here, the same entity, multiple events, right? We have created, updated, deleted, and so on. So what I want to do here is I will just, in a similar way, dump, and I will dump invoice to array once again. We show where this is coming from when that model is created. Similarly, I want to do for update this time. So whenever the invoice is updated, we get the same thing. It is as simple as that. Model observer. I will go back here to create an invoice. I keep forgetting. So we need to register this in the event service provider. This time I'll come down to the boot method of the event service provider, and we say invoice observe. What are we observing? Invoice observer. Actually, I find this counterintuitive that we are saying invoice observe the observer. It would have made more sense when we say invoice observer observe invoice. I don't know why exactly it is like this, but this is the syntax. I will go back one more time, hit. So you can see this time we get three things dumped. This one is coming from notify admin, okay. This is coming from notify customer, and we have invoice observer as well. In a similar way, for update, when we update a model, the event okay, the reason is that we did not actually update, we didn't change anything. So I'll go ahead. So when nothing has changed, when you call update, nothing happens because obviously nothing has been updated. Now the event is fired, of course in this case only for the model observer, because other listeners are subscribing to create, not update. The only one that subscribes to update event is the model observer here, right? Okay guys, If any of the things we have discussed so far makes sense to you, or you think it can make sense to someone out there, please help the channel grow by hitting the like button and the subscribe button as well, to encourage me to produce more content so more and more people out there can have access to this kind of lessons. Before we call it a day, one thing very important I need to point out is that you need to visit the official documentation of Laravel for events and listeners, because there are some nitty-gritty stuff that this lesson doesn't cover. Things like handling queued events, database transactions, and those kind of stuff. So take your time, go through the documentation, and see other more in-depth details how to implement the observer pattern. Until next time, bye bye.